Welcome, everyone. So good to be together again. Always happy to see you here with us at Drisha. Today's class is Conversations on the Parashah. Each week we have different members from Drisha's learning community. And this week we have Rabbanit Sara Wolkenfeld and Rabbanit Sarna with us. So good to have you both. Rabbanit Sara Wolkenfeld is the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria and a Rabbinic Fellow of the David Hartman Center. And Rabbanit Sarna is a member of Drisha's faculty and our Director of Teen Programs. So glad you're both with us, and I'll turn this to you both.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm always really excited to have the opportunity to be back at Drisha, as it were, and I'm excited to be here with you again, Rabbanit Sarna. So fun.
Yeah, so fun. I love teaching with you.
I love it too. We were just talking about before this class started, about how long this double parsha, or I should say, how long each of the parshiot that make up this week's double parsha actually are. And there's a special bonus at the end because it is the Shabbat of Parashat HaChodesh. So we are also getting ever closer to Passover and celebrating, I would say, not celebrating the new month quite yet, but celebrating, is it fair to say celebrating the idea of the new month? How's that?
Yeah, the lead up to the new month.
The lead up, right? This one gets a lot of lead time. So all of that is going on.
And by the way, it's related because the Mishkan went up on Rosh Chodesh Nisan.
Oh yes, we will talk a little bit about some of the connections at the end. But so bring it all. I think it's fair to say that between Purim and Pesach, there's just always like a lot going on, sort of liturgically and Torah-wise, and we're getting ready for Pesach and all the things. I would say that one frame that you could give to this week's parsha, and keeping in mind that it's also the end of Sefer Shemot, so we have like that's an added liturgical flourish, right? Like we're also going to get a chazak at the end. So one way to think about the framing of this parsha is around the idea of melacha, or work. Actually, the parsha switches back and forth between using the word melacha and using the word avodah. Arguably, both mean work or labor. I think that each have a different resonance, though. When we think about the word melacha, maybe what comes to mind is more Shabbat, the 39 prohibited categories of quote-unquote work. I feel like Rabbanit Sarna, you and I taught a different class about that. So save that for a different time, but that's the resonance, or one of the resonances of melacha. Avodah, for me, avodah actually evokes right now Pesach, I think. And the idea of being laborers or servants, slaves in Egypt. But certainly there are other resonances as well.
I would say like an important other resonance is like the avodah. Like on Yom Kippur, we use that language for the avodah and the Beit HaMikdash of the high priest, like the rituals of the high priest in the temple. And I feel like that's actually, just to like riff off of what you're saying, that's a really important thing that comes out of this week's parsha. So when we think about the like malachot of Shabbos, like 39 main categories of prohibited labor on Shabbat, we actually learn them out, like the connection between Shabbat and the laborers that were involved in the creation of the Beit HaMikdash, like that's, or Mishkan rather, sorry, like that's all Parashat Vayakhel, like that's this week's Parsha. And so the fact that the Parsha uses both avodah and melacha seemingly interchangeably, when in rabbinic literature, like avodah becomes like Kudshim, temple sacrifices, temple rituals, and melacha becomes Shabbos rituals, and then like this week's Parsha like knits them together. And like it reminds us that they're actually like built on the same foundation.
Totally. I like that idea of this parsha as kind of the linchpin of that. And I want to talk more about the Shabbat connection at the end, but I would say that it is not only what you said about it being the linchpin thematically, but like actually the parsha starts with don't do labor on Shabbat, right? It actually opens with 6 days you can work, 7th day no melacha, right? And it ends with the actual like the Mishkan is done, and we can kind of right, we're done with labor at the end of the parsha. In between, so you have this, just to give people a sense, you have this very extensive description, or really two sets of very extensive descriptions of all of the work that needed to be done to raise funds for the Mishkan. and then all of the work that needed to be done to actually implement the Mishkan. And you and I were actually talking about this also a few minutes ago, but just some of the descriptions are very beautiful of the people who both contributed supplies and did the work. So Nediv Lev, kind of generosity of spirit or of heart, is for the people who gave. And Chacham Lev, this, I don't know, how do you want to translate Chacham Lev?
Wisdom.
Wisdom, yeah, I wanted to have the heart, yeah, wisdom of the heart, right? Some kind of very deep wisdom of the people who actually built it. And there's a lot of jokes about how this represents the most successful capital campaign in Jewish history. And I do kind of want to frame our conversation today around that, because as you heard in the intro, and as you know, I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria. And I think that I'm very sensitive to this conversation, or this kind of dynamic that plays out in the Parsha between the people giving the supplies, giving the materials that were needed, and the people who were actually doing the work, because that's kind of what it is to be in my space in a Jewish nonprofit. I'm not a funder, and I'm also not exactly a fundraiser directly. Instead, I occupy this middle space of one of the people doing the work a lot of the time. And so I'm really interested in that space of using donor money to create things, which is what I see in this story.
You're like a Torah artisan.
I'm a Torah artisan. That would be awesome to be able to claim that. Maybe we should update our CVs. I like that. Yeah, so like, right, but we all are, right? We're in the space of using donor money to create things. We're trying to communicate with donors about what we need and how we're going to use it. And I've come to see over the years that it really is a partnership. And I think that you see that partnership in this week's Parsha in a lot of ways. And so I want to ask with you, how do we give and contribute meaningfully to communal projects in ways that are maximally impactful? And I think it's also a story about like what generosity can really accomplish. So I did share a source sheet in the chat. Hopefully everyone can see that. Oh, I think it was shared twice in a few different formats. Great. So I think I'm not going to share my screen because this is fine. I'm going to read this one pasuk that I think raises up some of these questions, and we'll talk about it. So after describing some of the fundraising process, or it's not just funds, it's not just money that's needed, it's materials, because we don't have that so much anymore. You could think of it as like in-kind donations, right? Like people are giving building materials to the Mishkan. And in Perek Lamed Vav Pasuk Zayin,
it does, by the way, like raise this interesting thing of like, was there actually no currency? Like, if you like, when the Jewish people were in the desert, like, was everything just barter, or did they not actually like have any needs that they needed to even barter for?
Yeah, I assumed it was just barter. I mean,
also, like, your shoes don't wear out, your clothes don't wear out, food falls from the heavens. Like, maybe you don't need anything.
Maybe you don't, maybe there's really nothing to be had. I mean, except from like the person next door, right? Like they have more of something, you have less of something, so you guys trade it. But I don't know that there were like stores along the way, or other people to buy things from. And it's a whole other interesting question, not for today's shiur, about where they even got the materials for the Mishkan. Right? There's some pretty extensive gold, silver, all sorts of things. Like, where did they get that from? I don't know.
I mean, the Torah's answer is that they took it from the Egyptians on the way out. So, like, there's lots of other questions, and each individual thing has its own story.
I mean, that is the Torah's answer, except it doesn't mention all of these things specifically as things that they took out. And that seems a little schleppy, but okay, right? Maybe they really schlepped.
What is a tachash?
And what is a tachash? My children are convinced it's a unicorn. So yeah, at least one child. Could be, right? So after they gather all these materials, here's what the Torah has to say. This was a tricky pasuk to translate. I actually chose Professor Everett Fox's translation of the different translations available on Sefaria, and I left the Hebrew in italics. So the work material, but the Hebrew says melacha, was enough for them for all the work, which is also melacha, to make it and more. This is a really strange verse. It like plausibly means that like they had everything they needed, something like that. But I think that there's at least two really strange things about this pasuk, and I invite people to share to share the questions that this verse raises for them in the chat or by unmuting. And then we'll ask you, Rabbanit Sarna. Anyone want to share? Should we have Rabbanit Sarna give it a try?
Okay. Oh, one of them is, oh, again, sorry, did someone else hop in?
Nope, I can't see him. I don't know if people have the
Fran,
chance.
go for it, Fran.
There was not enough material, but enough work from the sentence.
Right. There's something weird going on with the use of the word melacha at the beginning of the pasuk, I think is what you're saying, right? Like there's enough work. That's sort of what that means, right? There was enough work.
And they were willing to work?
Maybe, right? You're already up to an answer, right? There was enough willingness to work, right? It has to mean, I think what Fran is really saying is like, it's weird to say, and we'll see this in an actual source later, it's weird to say that there was enough work to do all the work, which is essentially, if you read the sentence through, what it's saying.
How and melacha can also be work, and can also be it always is for me an echo of Breshit. It always reminds me of Kiddush.
Yeah.
Kol melachto asher asa, and here you also have the juxtaposition of the shoresh asa and the shoresh melacha. And I think that that's worth noting also.
100%. I agree. That's another resonance, I think, of this word melacha, right? It's melacha in the sense of, as Rabbanit Sarna talks about, right, the Shabbat resonance of that, the 39 melachot, but also, of course, the act of creation, which is also an important parallel to the Mishkan.
And I think the and dayam, and that there's some sort of concept I always have of infinity with Breshit, and here they're saying the idea of that it was enough, that they brought more than enough, which somehow is an oxymoronic concept for me.
Yeah.
And Debbie, just to like push home your suggestion of the Breshit, right? That at the very end of Parashat Pekudei, we have Vayachal Moshe et hamlacha, like Vayachulu Hashemayim v'haaretz.
Right.
Yeah. Totally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
It's definitely all there, right? We're not imagining these resonances at all. They're definitely all there. And I think,
well, I think, excuse me for interrupting you, but I think it says Vayichal Moshe. I think that phrase is used also in when he stopped in Bahaloscha, when he stops putting it up and down. That same phrase is Vayichal Moshe when he finishes Lahakim et HaMishkan. That's that same concept. So that verb is used often, that it parallels both.
It's a repeating phrase. It would be interesting to see how often it appears in the context of melacha. Someone else can run that search right now, right? Whether it only appears in the context, like is the only thing you can be vayachal. I don't think so, but maybe in that construct it is. That's, I think, an interesting question. And I think you're also right to point to this idea of dayam being somehow contrasted with the idea of infinity. And that's, I think, the other tension in this pasuk. So we have this like too much melacha going on, like what exactly is happening with the word melacha here. And I think the other question or tension or just thing to notice, right? I think, Debbie, you were saying like you were strongly noticing this idea of dayam and hoter. And really those words are, unlike melacha, which just gets repeated too many times, dayam and hoter are they're like opposites, right? We'll see a source that says it's literally a tarte tesatre, which means like a total contradiction. Is it enough or is it extra? Right? Maybe you would say like, I don't know. I feel like I am very Jewish mother sometimes, and I only say that I have enough food if I actually have extra, right? If all the food gets eaten at Shabbos lunch, then I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't have enough food. But like in real life, I think that's not how that works. You either have like, you can have perfectly enough or you can have too much. So what is going on with all the melacha? And was it enough or was it too much? Arguably, both of those are fine, but I just want to know like which exactly was it, right? And those are definitely two questions that get raised by this pasuk. I am interested in starting with this melacha point, because I think we have gone so deep into this question of all the resonances of melacha, all the ways in which it's used. First of all, I just want to say, right, like it's definitely hearkening back to earlier in the Parsha, where it seems like everybody's working. The people contributing are working, and the people building are working, right? There's just a lot of melacha going around. But nonetheless, you see that the Mefarshim, pretty much everyone who comments on this verse, is struck by this use of the word, or the double use of the word melacha. So Rashi here says, on these words, ha-melacha haytadayam mechol ha-melacha, u'melechet ha-hava'ah haytadayam shelosei ha-mishkan. So I think, Fran, I think this is like a version of what you were saying, that the work of doing the Mishkan was enough for all the work that had to be done, or the work of bringing stuff for the Mishkan was enough for all the work that had to be done in the Mishkan, which I think is a way of saying there were enough materials, right? The people schlepping did a good job, the people donating did a good job, and then they had enough, right? Something like that. Okay, we'll leave that part of Rashi for now, but like that's like enough. The Gur Aryeh, who's a 16th century super commentary, I just like saying that word. Exactly. Rabbanit Sarna, a great idea. Let's be super commentaries for Purim next year. Right, a super commentary on Rashi, 16th century super commentary on Rashi. It just means he's the commentary on the commentary. So he literally says, commenting on this Rashi, the word melacha at the beginning of the pasuk, that word cannot mean what you think it means. You can't say that the work was enough for all the work. That's just not a normal thing. And so he's explaining to you why Rashi says, well, it was like the work of bringing, or really we would say, I mean, again, I think certainly my development officer would say, right, the fundraising was sufficient for the work that had to be done. Right? Does that seem reasonable, Sarna?
Yeah, 100%. Right? That it's like they had a full estimation of all their future costs and whatever. They had a great contractor, and so the work of raising the money, right? Like so, I think your director of development would be like privileged to, or like not privileged, would feel honored that someone would recognize what they're doing as work, right? Because most people would say, oh, the artisans, like they're the ones who are doing the real work, and you're just like facilitating it. And the director of development says back, no, what I do is hard work.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what I love about this. Yeah, go ahead.
But it looks like what you just said that Gur Aryeh said is what's said in the previous verse. It's the previous verse says that they it doesn't talk about the fundraising in those words, but they had enough stuff.
Right.
So how is this different? I don't.
Well, so first of all, the Gur Aryeh is just explaining what Rashi says, right? And he's just explaining it to you why Rashi feels the need to essentially translate the word melacha in two slightly different ways in the two different times that it's used in the pasuk. So exactly what Rabbanit Sarna said, they're both work. They're both work. And they're both being raised up as labor. And I think that is important in exactly the way that Rabbanit Sarna said. But you have to say that like the first labor is one kind of labor and the second labor is another kind of labor. So yes, this pasuk continues from the previous verse and is just saying, right, like, so yeah, again, the work of fundraising was enough for the work of doing.
Maybe what Fran is saying is that in the previous verse, you have the same, you have it almost explicitly, like ish ve'isha al ya'asu od melacha l'trumat hakodesh, right? So that's melacha l'trumat hakodesh seems to be very explicit, right? The work of donating to the holy.
Exactly. And that's what I was saying, that this resonates with what comes before in the Parashah. It's clear that throughout the Parashah, I think that melacha is used to describe both. But here's where it kind of comes out the most starkly, because again, I think that the word is used twice in one sentence, and it's really referring to two different, not just like two different categories of melacha, like the way we would say on Shabbat, like, you know, cooking is a malacha, and so is, I don't know, winnowing, right? Like, but two actually very different kinds of activity. One is fundraising, essentially, or bringing materials, giving materials, and the other is those very intricate acts of Bezalel's and his team that are described, of like, they carved the this, and they built the this, and they took the wood, right? Like, those are two very different kinds of actions. I don't do either, but you could easily imagine being highly qualified for one and not at all qualified for the other. So I think that that's what the Gur Aryeh, following Rashi, is drawing attention to. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. And yes, definitely throughout the Parsha, Melacha is used, including in the previous verse, Melacha is used to cover both. I also like the way that the Sarna formulates this, which I also put on your sheet. He says, Melechet hamitnadvim b'chol davar shehitnadvu, hayta dai la'osei melacha hamishkan. So the work performed by the volunteers, right, everything that they were volunteering, everything they were bringing, everything they were doing, was enough for the people actually doing the work, which again also evokes to me in my, right, like there could be so many associations, but my association is just thinking about, again, the work of professionals who are involved in the work every day. That's Bezalel, right? Bezalel was like doing the things, but he could not have done the things without this team of volunteers kind of backing him up. That's the donors, that's the board members, that's the people who, that's the community members who support. That's the people who can make it happen. And Bezalel couldn't have done his work without them. And I think that that's, again, the, Sarna is telling us that's the resonance of the word melacha being used twice in one pasuk. And I like the way also it kind of calls to mind, and here also, I think there's a Shabbat tie-in. I feel like you've taught about Shabbat more recently than I have, Rabbanit Sarna, that both the giving of time and money are equally kind of raised up and appreciated by this pasuk. And again, I agree, it happens throughout the Parashah, but this pasuk makes it really clear that it's not enough to have money, materials, bartering goods, and it's also not enough to have the skills. You actually need both. Questions or comments before we keep going?
I think you could identify them as one is our specific categories of verbs, of actions used in making it, and one is an overriding necessity that applies to all aspects of those categories, a foundational action that affects every aspect of it. In other words, fundraising is needed for every aspect of the building, while the other type of malacha is specific verbs and actions that each one is specific to a different category of building of it. One is a narrowly defined and only pertains to different parts of it, and the other one is an overarching. I think of it like Kedoshim Tiyu as opposed to specific mitzvot.
I was thinking that we actually use work in English in the same way. So like, I am going to work, or like everyone goes to work, right. Big work. And then I'm doing my work, little work.
Yeah.
I am a doctor. I am an Indian chief. I am right.
Right, exactly.
Or you have Melechet Machshevet, like for Bezalel. Right. And then you have, the person who did the rokem and the this and the, that, the rikma and that.
The spinning on the goats.
Spinning, yeah. I think that that's totally right. And so I think that all of that just makes it even more striking that, like you said, Rabbanit Sarna, it's the same idiom as in English, that we keep using the word malacha to refer to both. Because again, in English, we use that category word of work for everyone's work, but also we have specific words. And you could have imagined, like I could imagine the Torah setting up this pasuk in a different way, where it doesn't repeat that word, which is, like, I think we all have to admit, like, kind of, there is something confusing about reading this pasuk, right? There is that redundance that the Gur Aryeh points to. So again, I think it just raises up both kinds of work in a way that's really important. And yes, also draws our attention to the fact that, like, there was the work that supported the work. So there was the we call it the big W work, right? That supported all these like smaller kinds of work, like carving and building and all those things. Let's talk a little bit about the second like mismatch in the pasuk, which is, I think, the mismatch between Dayam v'Hoter. Again, was it enough to build the Mishkan, or was it too much? Yeah,
Right.
hi.
You're saying both work, like there are two kinds of work, fundraising and then the actual work of building of the Mishkan. But when I think of fundraising, I guess, or when you're talking about fundraising, are you talking about like in our day and age, the person who's going out and raising the funding or raising the money, or is it the people actually donating? Are they also doing melacha? Like which which melacha are you referring to, or is because or it could be all three. But
I think right. Yeah, I totally know what you're saying. I think in a way all three. I think that's a really good point. I think all three, but I do think that what the pasuk is emphasizing is the funders, right? That the funders are also involved in doing the work, even though they're like quote unquote just giving the money. And I think it's so funny, like, the way you asked the question about like today, like, I don't know, when I read this parsha, feel free to push back. If you ask me like where the action is happening, or like who do you want to be in this parsha? Like, I want to be Bezalel. Full disclosure, right? Like, that's so cool.
Literally name my child Bezalel.
Literally, exactly. It's a beautiful name, right? And like it evokes this I think he has incredible character traits, right? Bezalel, I think, she was once asked like what's the best description of a leader in the Torah, and I'm gonna go on a limb and say it is not Moshe. Moshe has some like good descriptions. The best possible description is definitely of Bezalel. If you're just looking for like a diatribe on leadership qualities, it's definitely Bezalel. And I really think that yeah, like I want to be him in the parsha. The funders, like, okay, they're like bringing their gold. They're like, it's like nice, but it's not like wow, I think, as described in the parsha. Whereas, again, I'll just speak for myself. I think again, as someone who works for a nonprofit, right, the funders are really, really important. Like, I love my work, but I know we wouldn't be able to do anything without the funders, and that's like really sort of top of mind. And I just think we live in a society in general that kind of venerates philanthropy. And so that's a real inverse. And I think the fact that they both seem to be equally valued here is really important. So I'm grateful to you for asking that question, because I think that is what's being highlighted. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Let's talk for a second about Dayam v'Hoter, this mismatch between the like enough versus too much. So on the one hand, I think that there is, like, you do see a strain in rabbinic literature in the Mefarshim that talks about it kind of the way I talked about Shabbat lunch, right? That it's like better to have extra. The Nitziv in his commentary, the Hamek Davar, says that, I like, this is also like very crafty. Derech omanim keshechaser lahem ezo chaticha ktana kesef v'zahav la'kli osim haptitim sheshafu b'maaseh od chaticha ktana. Right? You can like, if you run out of materials, you can like take the little shreds and piece them together and like use them to make the rest of the kli, the rest of the vessel that you're making. And so there is a way in which I would call this, right, like kind of bootstrapping, right, or like working on a tight budget, right? Somehow you're going to take the $5 from here and the $5 from here, and you can like make it work, and that's like okay. Sometimes
that's the thrifty version.
The thrifty version, exactly. That's like the version where you're like asking people like just contribute like $1 more, right? But he says, aval ein bezeh tiferet hakli. That's not the most beautiful way to make the vessel. Just doesn't come out as well. And so this Dayam v'Hoter is like, there was like enough, but not like just like enough, not just like barely enough, like enough that you could sort of build it with like a sigh of relief, right? You could cut the pieces to exactly the size you wanted and not worry that you were wasting that little like corner scrap piece, because you had enough to like cut the materials the way you wanted them to. again, I feel like I only sort of know what I'm talking about because not a particularly crafty person, but I don't know, this sounds plausible, right? Yeah, I think so. So that's like one Dai v'hoter model. There is another kind of discourse in discussing this that I think really starts maybe from the Or HaChaim, and that's the next. I haven't been totally following along on your sheets, but that's the next source on the sheet. So the Or HaChaim was also a Torah commentator and also a Kabbalist, and so he also notices this mismatch, and he says, it's possible that it's teaching us. It's teaching us about how much God loved the Jewish people. Because the Jews brought more than was really necessary, God was concerned, God was worried about the honor, the kavod of each person who brought materials. And actually got all of it put into the Mishkan. Here's a different problem. You have donors who are donating things, and you actually wind up with too much. What do? You have two donors who both want to endow, I don't know, the door of your synagogue. Okay, I apparently really don't work in fundraising, right? But like, right, you have two people who want to sponsor Kiddush the same week. What do? There is such a thing as too much generosity. Sometimes you get too much silver and not enough gold. I don't know, right? There's all sorts of ways that this could play out. And so the Dayam v'hoter here, the Or HaChaim is telling us like, well, really, it was kind of like too much. But imagine if you were, right, like imagine you needed, I don't know, whatever, 10 somethings, and you were the person to bring the 11th something. Like you're going to feel rejected. You're going to feel like you're not part of the building of the Mishkan.
I feel like all of your examples were like with fungible items like money or whatever, but you actually have to think about it as non-fungible items because they're not sending in money. So it's like, so like imagine like, I don't know, like your two people gave you jewelry to wear to the same event and they're both going to be crushed if you're not wearing their necklace.
Yeah. Or just like, I think what you're saying is really important because it's also like the money you could spend on something else. But like if you each give me like gold earrings to melt down and I'm like, oh, here, I'm giving you back your earrings because we actually didn't wind up using them. Right? Like you're going to like, aren't you going to feel left out, rejected? Right? Like
also because something that used to be attached to my body was about to become a piece of the like God's house.
Yeah.
And you just told me like, no, sorry, not yours.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I hadn't thought about that aspect of the jewelry, right? But I think that is also something that happens when you donate money. I mean, I was having this conversation with someone like little kids when they go to school, and I feel like many of us will have experience with this, right? Like, so our children's school tells my kindergartner to bring a penny every Friday to put in the tzedakah box. And like, I think that's really cute. I think it's really nice. Half the time I forget to give them the penny, but it's clearly not about the money that's being raised, right? Like, I don't think they're not funding any major nonprofits off the penny that all 20 children bring. It's this like physical act of putting the penny into that little box that they have. It's really different when you're like Venmoing somebody or you're donating via credit card. It is like real, like, so I think it's not even like the fungible, but really that like physicality that you were talking about, Rabbanit Sarna. Like it's really different when it's something that you held on to and touched, and now you're giving it to somebody else. Yeah. And Reba again said this is like the man, like this idea of like just enough for each day. And God has this incredible capacity to control quantities, to give more, but then also to kind of like pull back or like control how much there is. And I love this image that somehow, even though there was really too much, there was extra, at the end of this comment, the Or HaChaim says that it was a nes, kinasa nes v'lo hotir. Even though they gave too much, God somehow managed to like smush it all together. I guess God via Bezalel was able to smush it all together so that you had this this Mishkan that didn't or they didn't change the plans at the last minute. They didn't say, I guess this is actually, you can tell I'm not a fundraiser, right? Because this is what you would really do if you got too much money. You'd be like, okay, let's run another program. Let's build another room. Let's
invest it in the stock market.
Let's invest it in the stock market, right? There's always something you can do with more money. But I guess that's to your point, Rabbanit Sarna, about them not, seems like currency was not the thing, wasn't the materials they were working with. And so it's like literally like, what am I going to do with this like hunk of gold if I can't put it into the Mishkan? And I don't get to just like change the plans. The plans are very clear. We've had the plans now already for a while. We know exactly what the space is going to look like and what all the kelim, what all the vessels are going to look like. And so if there's extra materials, are we going to have to reject something from somebody? And I just saw that Jennifer put in a concordance link for Kol HaMelacha. Okay. Oh, for Chal HaMelacha. Okay. I will look at that afterwards. That is super helpful. Thank you. So that's the kind of direction that the Orach Chaim takes this, that it's really about the Dai V'Hoter is really a reflection of, first of all, something that actually happened. It really was too much and it became just enough, but also that there's an aspect of God getting involved in this, again, in this capital campaign. And, I think that question earlier about like, am I raising up the work of the fundraiser or the work of the worker or the work of the funder? So I don't have an analogy to God in all of this. I think, that is something that makes this story special and unique, but there is this like controlling force of like, somehow we're going to make sure that this all works, that everybody's, capital W work, right, fits together, given each of the individual roles that they're playing with it. And that's God's role as kind of like, should we call God the project manager in this, the CEO, of this entire project. The Kedushat Levi takes this, I would say, like even a step further. The Kedushat Levi is Rav Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. It's a 19th century Hasidic work, but also kind of playing off of this same idea. And I will say that I took both the Hebrew and the English from Sefaria. The English is not a perfect direct translation of the Hebrew, but I'm not going to read the whole thing anyway. It's long, and I actually excerpted it's even longer. But I did want you to see it because I'm so, again, sort of taken with this idea. And somebody said this earlier. Who said this earlier? Maybe it was you, Debbie, or Fran, about the resonance with creation, and that there is something about, right, Melacha resonates with Shabbat. It also resonates with creation, and there is something about this dayam idea, this idea of it being right, just enough and not too much, that also evokes other Torah themes, right? Other big moments in the Torah. So the Kedushat Levi says, "V'hinei lichora, hai dayam v'hoter, hu tarti desatra hadari." Right. So just like that, he says it in Gemara language, right? Like this is really a contradiction in terms. I think this is the best way to say tarti desatra, right? Like you can't have too much and also enough. It just doesn't work. And I'm skipping to the next bolded section. Almost bolded section. God is called Kel Shakai. Shin Daled Yud contains the word dai in it. It's God who said enough to the world, because God is actually infinite. This might be a familiar idea to many of you. God had to limit God's self in order to create something physical like the world, and in order to contain even part of God's self in the world. So creation could be like ever expanding. It could just keep going. There could be hoter, there could be extra, there could be too much in the world if it just kept expanding forever, if God had sort of put all of God's self into that creation. And instead God said, you know what, it's like enough, right? I'm not gonna give all that I can give. And in the final bolded section, he writes, God had to act in the world according to the capacity of those who were receiving, and not according to God's infinite giving capacity. This also really resonated with me and made me think about power of giving. And right, I said before that I definitely want to be Bezalel in this story. There is a way in which Bezalel, I think, has the most power in the story. Certainly Bezalel sounds like the most powerful person. Again, not most powerful being, leaving aside God, but most powerful person in having the capacity to create. But again, I think, there would be no Bezalel, there would be no work of the Mishkan without the money to be donated. And what happens when the floodgates are just opened and you have all the money in the world? Sounds like a good thing, but is it really a good thing? And if a donor comes to you and says, I'm going to give you $1 million, now build a program, and you say, well, actually, I had a program in mind, but it was a $100,000 program. And the donor says to you, you know what? I'm not interested in your $100,000 program. I only want to give you $1 million, right? And I want you to create $1 million program. But you don't have an idea for $1 million program. That wasn't your vision. That's not the thing you thought you were building. That can actually be pretty overwhelming. Yeah. And I think that the tremendous wisdom that's being expressed here, or the Kedushat Levi is attributing this great wisdom, or is talking about God's great wisdom in this case of not giving too much, but it's paralleled in this act of the creation of the Mishkan. That there was enough given, God was able to absorb the extra, if we take the Or HaChaim's position, but it wasn't so much that it overwhelmed the builders. Questions or comments?
I'm just so taken by this idea of like I think it really applies to everything. Like educators actually think about this 100% of the time, right? Like that's the whole trick of pedagogy, is like, how are people gonna be able to receive this content that I want to teach it to them? How do I package it right? How do I explain it right? How do I make sure it's the right stuff, not too much, not too little? But we never think about it this way in terms of money. Like, too much money, what could that be? But at the end of the day, like when people are making donations, there's a responsibility to actually use it for what they're hoping you to do. And that means you have to be able to do all the work that's involved in their investment.
Yeah. I am so glad you took it to education, because it was obviously my first thought when I read this. I was like, oh, this is just like you have to teach like the capacity of your students, right? But I agree with you. We don't usually talk about it in terms of money or even physical materials. And there is a way in which I think I would go even further and say there's and this gets back to Jessica's point before about the fundraiser and the donors. Like there's something called responsible philanthropy. There is really a partnership between the philanthropist and those receiving, and it's about making that shidduch, right? It's about that match between what I need and what you have to give. And if there's a mismatch, that can be really pernicious.
And the other place, sorry, I'm just like, with this. The other place we talk about it a lot is food. And in the Torah, we talk about it a lot with food.
Yes.
Right? This is the thing with the Slav. Like, I want meat. I'll take so much meat. And then it's like, yeah, you're going to be like vomiting that out of your nose. And that like the idea of like, well, you want something, and you can't even contemplate that you want it only within limits.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it brings it back to Reba's points about the man, right? That like we want food, but just enough food. And again, like I think exactly what is anxiety provoking about the man, right? The idea you're going to have exactly enough food. Don't worry, you're not going to be at all hungry, but you're going to have just enough food for one day. Like who among us would be willing to live like that? And that sounds terrifying to me. I just gave up my second refrigerator and I'm freaking out, right? Like it's not maybe instinctive. I think you're right, Rabbanit and Sarna. Like we think we want more, and when there's too much, like I think in this group it's okay to say we're all very privileged, and when it's too much, we feel like okay, but like better than having too little. Okay, I feel like that's what I would say, right? Better than having too little, but is it better than having too little? Maybe marginally, but it's still not great. Sorry, I thought I saw somebody's hand up, but maybe not.
Excuse me, I had to leave for a few minutes, so if this was said before, just cut me off. I had two thoughts. One is less is more, I think is what you're saying. And in a book by Malcolm Gladwell, he points out at the beginning that when you walk into a supermarket and you're faced with 4 choices of cereal or 4 choices of a brand of something, you can choose. When you're faced with a wall of cereals, you just walk past it.
It's the Trader Joe's model.
Exactly. That when there are too many choices, our brains just shut down. That living with less, the Marie Kondo, whatever, makes you appreciate each item much more. And just limiting yourself has a quality of enhancing each item, as opposed to cheapening when there is so much about it. I always think of it when you have the idea of shechacha. It's my own thing. I happen to apply it to clothing, that if you have clothing in your closet and you forget about it and you haven't used it in a year or two, then I say, then give it away or put it in a bag. And if you haven't touched that bag in a year, then you can easily give it away because then it's not meaningful to you, and let somebody else have it.
Yeah,
I think that's that idea.
That's really powerful. Yeah, I think again, this gets to me a little bit to the point that Rabbanit Sarna raised about like the difference between like fungible and non-fungible things. Because like the clothing, it's like, well, this physical thing I haven't used. But what about when it comes to money, where you're like, oh, I could stash that in the bank. I could always use that for later. But you also said, Rabbanit Sarna, like when donors give money, we have a responsibility to use it for the thing that they donated it for, except if they give to general operating support, right? But like that's definitely something that I see. And another hat I wear in the nonprofit world, I'm also an honorary trustee of the Jewish Women's Foundation of Chicago. So I really see how this plays out in terms of donors wanting to see that their money is well spent. And again, I think this model of the Mishkan, it's not just, again, everyone always says like the best capital campaign in Jewish history. It's the best capital campaign, not only because they so quickly met their goals, but because it was such a great shidduch of giving and needs and implementation. That's really what makes it this great capital campaign. It seems God was sort of finessing things a little bit, right? But great, right? Whatever it takes, because it was enough. It was enough to build the Mishkan. It was enough to build the Mishkan and not have the artisans feel stressed about not having quite enough or feeling like they might not have quite enough. It was enough, but it was all used so that it made everyone feel valued, made everyone feel their contribution was used, which is such an important thing for those who are actually doing the work, to make sure not just like, thank you so much for your dollars, but am I showing you how you're making a difference? Because you gave that money or that gold or that piece of clothing so that you could make a difference, so you could be part of things. Exactly. I love what you said, Rabbanit Sarna, about like the earrings that were on my ears. Like if I take those off and give them to you, I really want to know that it contributes to the community. And I'm not going to feel sad about giving up those earrings as long as I know that it supported, communal worship in this case. And that's so important. And that's something that you're giving back to me as the one who does the work in this paradigm. And I think all of that is definitely playing out here. I want to also bring this back a little bit and kind of tie the two pieces together to the concept of melacha. So again, all of these things are work. All of these things need to be done. I think maybe Debbie, you were the one who used the phrase melachat machshavet. Like for our purposes right now, I'll say like thoughtful work, right? Work with a lot of intention. Both parts of the work have to be done with a lot of intention, both the giving and also the actual building. And in the middle of the Parsha, as was quoted earlier, there's this moment where the people, right, the melacha, right, in this case, the avodah also stops. So Moshe said, or God said to Moshe, right, or the builders said to Moshe, the people have brought more than enough. Vayamru al Moshe le'mor, marbim ha'am lahavi midei ha'avodah l'melacha asher tzivah Hashem la'asot otah. Right, they've brought more than enough for all the work. There again, you have avodah and melacha. Vayitzav Moshe vayavir kol b'machaneh le'mor ish v'isha al yasu od melacha v'trumat hakodesh v'yikaleh ha'am mehavi. So Moshe puts out the call and says, man and women, right? Don't do any more melacha. And here again, you see this word being used in both ways. Don't do the work of bringing the stuff for the Mishkan. Vayikaleha amehavi, and the people stop bringing. My teacher, Rabbanit Dr. Michal Tukachinsky, points out that that moment of they stopped bringing is also teaching us something really, really important about a vision of successful communal giving. That when somebody says to you, stop, it's enough, I'm good now. If you're a donor, if you're a supporter who is doing it, who's supporting, who's donating, who's giving things in order to be in control, you're going to be like, what are you talking about? Stop. I think you probably see this more with volunteers than with money, just in my experience, right? Like, what do you mean don't do that anymore? I'm so important to your organization. I'm so important to your vision. I'm doing all these things. How could you be telling me to stop? And Rabbanit says the fact that when Moshe said stop, they stopped is proof positive, is the demonstration that these people were doing it for God. She says for God, I would add for God and for communal need, right? In order to support this vision of worship going forward. That's really why they were doing it. The fact that they stopped when Moshe said stop proves that was their intention.
Did you see anything about the Aleph and Vayakhel, like, right? And we've been talking about Vayakhel Moshe,
yeah.
And then here we have Vayakhel. I just wonder. I mean, I'll ask my spouse about this after. I don't know whether you know anything about this.
No, I did see that it's like a thing. Yeah, ask your spouse, because Hebrew grammar is not my thing. But it definitely is a thing.
Because it has this resonance of like Adoni Moshe Kilaim or whatever, right? Like when you have Eldad and Medad having prophecy in the camp where they're like not supposed to be, and Yoshua is like, Moshe, like shut it down, right? Like that feels to me like the resonance here, which is so different from like, and it was concluded. Like that's different than Vayakhulu Hashemayim Haaretz somehow.
Or is it, right? Or is it just like sort of two, like one just takes it a little further, right? Maybe
one feels a little more like Kilaim feels like, okay, like shutting it down, like it's more, I don't know, it feels more like active somehow.
Maybe, yeah. It's a really interesting resonance. Rabbanit also says that this moment of stop doing work, right? Like stop doing that is also like brings us back to the Shabbat model. She says it's like the moment when it's like, okay, everybody stop, it's time to light candles. And then I say back, no, we have 18 minutes, right? But no, it's like that moment when you're done. You're doing your thing, you're doing it, you could keep doing it indefinitely, it feels like. It doesn't feel like there would necessarily be a natural stopping point. And Shabbat comes and tells you you're done. So in this case, Moshe says, right, you're done, you stop. And that's the end of it, and you have to like end the work. So I wonder, like, to me, that feels like connected to the idea of like shutting down that you mentioned.
I think also like similar to what you're saying, and I think this probably is what you're saying, but at a certain point, the funding becomes more about the person who donated than about the cause that you're donating to. And maybe that's what this is saying. Like, right, like it's all about me. I was able to, look what I did. Look, this building is donated in my honor versus the cause that you're actually donating to. And I think it's interesting that it's at this point, like with the Mishkan, where it's like so opulent and so it feels so actually gaudy. And, in a way, I think that we're not used to, or I'm not, I guess, like seeing that in just our Jewish history and halacha, but still God is saying, like, at a certain point, even when it's so opulent, it's still like enough, you still gotta tone it down and stop at a certain point.
And there are no plaques in the Mishkan, right? Donated by.
Seems like there were in the Beit HaMikdash for what it's worth.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking about that. No, but I think you're right, Jessica. It's so interesting, right? That like even with this like beautiful, gorgeous silver, there's gold, but like yesh gvul, friends, like there is a point at which we say like, but just that much. And again, they weren't given permission to like change the plans and add another wing into the Mishkan, right? Oh, there's so much money, let's just build more. I really think that would be my instinct, right? Is like if you get more resources, so do more. And I do think that this Vayichal, again, as a few people have now mentioned, is this language of, like you're done, right? You're done. you did the thing and now it's done. Now you're going to stop. And the final piece of the Parsha and of the book of Shemot is, I put those final psukim on the pasuk, is that on the source sheet, is that the Mishkan is set up. Vayachas ha'anan et ohel moed uchvod Hashem aleh hamishkan. That the presence of God, the cloud comes to rest on the tent, and the glory of God fills the Mishkan. That there is this okay, right, we're done. And look, it worked. It worked. Again, it's a success, not just because we raised all the money. It's a success because the vision was fulfilled in all the ways that we spoke about. And now God actually can be present in this way. Again, it was a successful vision. And I just want to say one thing about Parashat HaChodesh, about the tie-in to Rosh Chodesh here. Again, this important mitzvah, this first announcement of HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodeshim, that you're going to have the month of Nisan as the first month. And this is really sort of taken as, in a way, I would say like the beginning of Jewish time in some ways. That this is the beginning of a system of counting and being able to set up holidays and knowing when things are happening. And that's really going to be important in terms of establishing holiness in time. And I think there's a lot of connections that we could talk about if we had more time between this idea of Rosh Chodesh and Pesach and the Mishkan and all these things. But certainly one piece is this connection of sacred time and sacred space, the connection between creation of the world, the Mishkan, and Shabbat, that there are times of work, and then there are times when we rest, when we aren't working, when we're enjoying that which we created. And the whole mechanism of doing this, in a sense, is going to be Rosh Chodesh, is going to be having a sense of where in time we're situated and when we pause and rest. And I'll just mention, and then I'll take any questions, and also want to hear Rabbanit Sarna react to this. I couldn't resist putting one last Rashi on the sheet. It's Rashi quoting the Midrash. It's also beautiful in the Midrash if you want to look it up, but Rashi is shorter. That Moshe blessed the people at the end of the process of building the Mishkan, but it doesn't tell us in the Torah what the blessing was. And the Midrash says that Moshe said, may it be God's will that the Shekhinah, the presence of the divine, rests on the work of your hands. And to me, that ties together all these pieces about Melacha, that whatever, again, I love this image that like we have the work, and then we all do our own work. And ultimately what we want is to bring the divine presence into the world. Ultimately what we want is for God to infuse divine energy into the work that we're doing, whether it's the work of raising the funds, bringing the things, actually donating, being the philanthropist, or doing the work itself. And that's something I think really ties together, again, all these kinds of melacha in this double parsha.
Yeah, I love that. And I also love what you're pointing out about Rosh Chodesh Nisan being both the beginning of Jewish time and the beginning of this like Jewish space, like the first Jewish space before we get to the land of Israel, space that can be mobile with us, which I think is also like a really important for us in the diaspora and the exile, right? Like a really important, the Mishkan is such an important model for us. And to know that like kind of the Rosh Chodesh Nisan of the first Jewish space was this like diaspora Jewish space. Like that's like the primordial Jewish space is a space in diaspora. To me, it just feels like so valuable and so important. And that both of those things are tied up in like, and now you will rest. A lot of people might be familiar that there's a tradition that on Rosh Chodesh, women like have a yontif for them. And one of the earliest sources that talks about that is the Tosfot commentary, the Das Kanim, and they bring in that it's their feeling is that actually it was Rosh Chodesh Nisan that was the first Rosh Chodesh rest for women, and it got kind of extrapolated from there to the rest of the Rosh Chodeshim. But why is it Rosh Chodesh? It's because women did not participate in the golden calf, but did enthusiastically participate. Like like a lot of commentators say like Vayavo anashim al hanashim, which is the language, is strange language at the beginning of the Parashah, that the men came like on the women, makes it sound like the Ramban says like the women got there first, the men were like running to kind of keep up, and their enthusiasm for the Mishkan is what earned them kind of this day of like the Mishkan being built as like their own day of rest. So I think the tying in that both like time includes rest and building includes rest. I really like that also.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. I think we have to wrap up. But this was so fun.
So fun.
I think it's okay to wish everyone a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, given where we're at in time. I know everybody's starting to making a face at me. Maybe not. But I will, how about this? I will at least wish you a happy Shabbat Chazak, right? A happy end of Sefer Shemot.
Shabbat Chazak. Thank you.
And a beautiful month ahead. And yeah. And thank you for learning with me.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Wolkenfeld and Rabbanit Sarna. And thank you, of course, to all the participants who joined us today and are part of our learning community. Looking forward to seeing you again next week. We'll be hearing from Rabbanit Sarna again, along with Miss Sophia Stepansky. Thank you so much. Lehitraot, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.